Bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. My name is Ahmad Abu-Hakmah, and today I'm joined with our esteemed panelists, Sister Nafeesah Scott, Brother Kareem Abdul Matin, and Brother Sharif Rosen for an important discussion titled Towards Prophetic and Inclusive Masajid. I wanted to give a very brief exposition a very brief abstract about what we intend to cover in this session, as well as the limitations of this session. So we know that our masajid are supposed to be the spiritual lampposts for the community, where everyone can come and receive the spiritual nourishment that everyone is entitled to. But unfortunately, there are subsets of the Islamic community, of the Muslim community, that for one reason or another are disenfranchised from the masajid. This is a discussion that's inseparable from the African American Muslim community, many women in the Muslim community, converts, as well as the youth, who perhaps face varying degrees of racism, misogyny, microaggressions in different ways. And the reality is that the true vibrance of Allah's deen cannot be realized without meaningful and principled inclusivity with the prophetic character that we receive through revelation. And this session will begin to explore some of the factors influencing masjid disenfranchisement, and perhaps talk about some of the practical steps for us to heal and grow as a beautiful community. And there are limitations to this session. The limitations include that we cannot obviously cover all the bases for everyone who may be disenfranchised in a single session. This is perhaps the questions that you hear today are questions that need to be asked to a lot of different types of people. Need to be asked to a panel just understanding the struggles that converts go through, just the struggles that African Americans go through, just the struggles that women go through, just through the experience that women of color go through, female converts, and so forth, college students, youth. So this is perhaps one of a series of discussions just on this subject as well, but it's under the umbrella of healing discussions under race. So perhaps the undertone of this will focus on disenfranchisement of African American Muslims. Joining me, as I said, is Sister Nafeesah Scott, Brother Kareem Abdul Matin, and Brother Sharif Rosen. I just wanted to briefly introduce everyone here. Sister Nafeesah Scott converted from Christianity to Islam and became a Muslim in the 1970s as a college student. She moved from Brooklyn, New York to the Capital District in 1984. She attained a Master's of Science from SUNY Albany in '89 in the field of education. And she's certified to teach pre-K through 12th grade and holds multiple certifications. Having worked in the field over 30 years, she has worked in various positions as a teacher, a reading specialist, an assistant principal, and a teacher, trainer, and supervisor. Brother Sharif Rosen is the Muslim chaplain at Williams College. He completed his chaplaincy training at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in New Hampshire and at Albany Med. He's currently completing his graduate degree in religious studies at Harvard Seminary and studied Arabic and Islam in Amman, Jordan for 5 years before returning to the US. Outside of college and hospital settings, Brother Sharif also provides spiritual and emotional support to individuals seeking compassion-centered, confidential, non-judgmental space to explore and address challenges and concerns in their lives. Brother Sharif is originally from Los Angeles, and he embraced Islam in 2002 while in college. Brother Kareem Abdul Matin is also a brother who has embraced Islam through the lens of coming through Christianity and then the Nation of Islam, and then coming to Islam itself. He does not want a long biography to be shared over him. He's fine having us say he's a member of the community, and he's actually been a long-standing member of the community. He's a member of the board, and he served prior to his retirement as a youth counselor in Capital District. And so to start our discussion, I wanted the panelists to get to know a little bit about each of our journeys. And this is something that really needs a lot more time, but perhaps starting with Sister Nafeesah Scott, I'd like to ask the question of what brought you to Islam?
Well, I was actually searching for the truth. I was in college, a junior, and I lived close to a masjid, and I was interested in Islam. So I went to the masjid. It was the Islamic Center of Jersey City, because I was in Jersey City State Teachers College. So I went there, and I learned about Islam. I liked it, and I did Shahada. I was kind of forced to do Shahada before I was ready, but they kind of wanted me to make Shahada. So I had in my mind, that I'm from the church. I like the church, and if I don't like this, I'll get out. So that was 40 something years ago. So I accepted Islam as the truth, the Quran is the truth, and the way, the life I should live.
Jazakallah khair for sharing that, Sister Nafeesah. Brother Kareem, would you be able to share briefly your story?
Inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammadin wa sallam. I started searching when I was a teenager, probably in 16 or 17. I had been very active in the church, Episcopal church. And at that particular point, I was contemplating becoming a priest, actually. But I was searching, and I remember very early and going through another phase of my life where I decided I didn't feel connected to any particular religion, and I made dua. I didn't know who I was making dua to. That God, if you're there, guide me. Okay, from that point, and actually coinciding with that point, you're talking about the 60s, and there was a period. Everyone during that period of time was becoming either already involved or becoming aware and becoming active in the struggle that was a civil rights struggle going on in the 60s on different levels. And I hadn't quite decided which path I was going to take. So I kind of diverted from my pursuit of religion, and I tried to decide what path I'm going to take because of basically the same issues that we're dealing with today. Injustice, racism, all of these things that were going on. And that particular time, there was also the backdrop of the Vietnam War. But teenagers and young adults were very, very active in some aspect of that struggle. And I had to decide which avenue I was going to take. And actually, I was dead set at that particular time on becoming a revolutionary, okay? And Allah decided something different for me. And Allah brought me through a different path and brought me to the Nation of Islam. I thought at that particular point that was Islam. It wasn't until later that I found out that I had been misdirected by certain individuals and philosophy and the fact that it was not Islam. However, the Nation of Islam had a lot of qualities that I felt are essential and still feel are essential. But from that process, I slowly evolved into mainstream Islam. I took my shahada and became Muslim. That was 40 some years ago also. So basically, it was a struggle of faith, and that which I ultimately won out. But it was also a struggle that I wanted to be involved in some level of change, some level of struggle, and at that particular time, like I said, the Nation of Islam was the avenue that I took because it had an element of spirituality in it, of what I saw as spirituality at that time, but it also had an element of addressing the issues that we were facing in the community. So basically, that was my path.
Jazakallah khair for sharing, brother Sharif.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. First off, I want to say thank you and express my appreciation for the invitation to be with you all today to have this important conversation. And I'm honored to have been invited, and I hope that whatever I share can be of some insight and benefit for our community in these challenging times. When I think about my own conversion and my own embrace of Islam, I have increasingly, I tend to not think about it in any single way, or in the same way that I initially thought that, or I don't think about it in the same way that I may have thought about it, the conversion, when it happened some 18, 20 years ago. Just to back up a little bit, I grew up in a home that was, through which there was really no spiritual foundation or religious foundation. My mother is a Filipino Catholic. My father is a very secular Jew. And there wasn't any encouragement around spirituality or ritual or devotional practice growing up. And so I was really left to embark on this quest for meaning, on this quest for contextualizing my own life and existence within a wider global and cosmic sense, you might say, really on my own. And in this path of seeking and searching, subhanAllah, Allah placed people in my life for whom they exemplified for me some of the qualities and a theology that was both coherent but also very deeply inspiring. And the more people that I met as I was on this search for wisdom, for truth, for guidance, I started to realize that it wasn't the people necessarily that were drawing me to Islam, but it was the teachings. And ultimately, I think what happened to me was that I fell in love with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the traces of his character and the traces of his teachings as they were being manifest on differing people. Now, I want to say briefly that when I said at the beginning that I look at my shahada in different ways now than say I may have earlier, the fact is that each day in our prayerful life, we're actually renewing our shahada. And so I actually I think about how my own process of enrichment and depth and connection to my Islam is something that looks very different now with each day than it did say 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 18 years ago when I embraced Islam. So that I'm learning new things about what inspires me, what calls to me within these teachings. I'm learning, I'm finding my points of connection, my points of inspiration around things now that may not have been as apparent to me early in my Islam. So I think that my own spiritual trajectory is somehow aligning with events and things in my life, so that my Islam means something more to me now, means something different to me now, even than it did when I first converted. Whereas when I first converted to Islam, I was really looking for a coherent theology and a coherent worldview. And now, more so now and in recent years, I see Islam not only as a vehicle for a most coherent worldview and theology, but also as a vehicle to living most lovingly and most compassionately in the world. So, from the emphasis on theology, and then through a practice, our legal traditions, which I've studied and have appreciated, I also am appreciating now, in recent years, the power of really deep understanding and reflection on a spiritual practice that is deeply connected to Allah, that is not only concerned with ritual, but also the relationship, the transcendent relationship between the servant and their Lord, but also between our relationships with one another. So all of that is to say that my conversion, while it happened at a moment in time, it's still ongoing. And I think that my development and evolution as a Muslim is still very much underway. And so I'm hopeful that Allah will continue to educate me and guide me towards that which is going to be most beneficial for my own spiritual heart, and place me in a deeper state of surrender to Him. So that's how I would approach that.
Barakallahu feekum. Thank you for sharing all that. And I think what's consistent in the answers is you're all truth seekers, and you're trying to find transcendent truth and something that gave a deeper meaning and a framework for living. And there was something that you found in Islam that you did not find anywhere else. And as Brother Sharif was saying, considers his conversion to be ongoing. This is alluding to the different levels of faith, whether it's Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, perhaps, and may Allah allow us to taste the depths of Ihsan in our preaching. Now, as we saw, and as you described the beauty or the different things you saw that attracted you to Islam, that's one thing. But this is a question that makes us a little bit uncomfortable. While you saw the beauty in Islam, were there inconsistencies between the beauty in Islam that you saw and what you saw Muslims in the communities that maybe you've interacted with actually do? In other words, what is doctrinally found, or what is found in the Quran and Sunnah, did you find that in the way that people in the masajid or in the Muslim communities behaved? And perhaps we can start with Sister Nafeesah.
Thank you. I saw the last one, and when you asked me to do this, the question came into my mind. This is not exactly an answer to this question, but I think it's kind of leading up to it. The question I asked is, what is making the Muslim community have these discussions now? Is it because of all the, you know, the media coverage, the social media coverage, or is it that the Muslims are starting to realize that this country is brutally anti-Black? So from the other one that I watched, the other episode of this discussions, Brother Jaffer said that that one thing is that the community needs to really know more about African Americans. They need to kind of understand them. And what I took from that was that, you know, maybe the community doesn't know that Blacks are the most racialized identity in the United States. And when I say racialized, I mean that this is something that came from the British colonialists and maybe others, where they would take a specific group of people and they would be taken over them. And they meant to keep it that way. So all these years in this country, Black people are still in this situation. Also in America, Brother Abdul Matin was talking about a systemic racism or a structural racism. And what that does, it targets individuals who are not white. And it's a structural advantage which favors white people over others. It might have been set up in the beginning to be over Blacks, but now there are so many other cultures, ethnic groups here. Still, there's the favor is for white people, and they've done it systematically through employment, salaries and opportunities. They've done it through the legal system. They've done it through the police. They've done it through housing. They've done it through the medical profession, and they've also done it somehow with foods that they distribute into the Black community. And the medical profession, which, you know, there's a lot of studies and a lot of data out there. They found that 60% of doctors are biased against African Americans. And my grandmother, when she was in her lifetime, Black people were not allowed to go to certain hospitals. If you had a fatal illness and you couldn't get to a hospital that took care of you, you would just die. So, you know, the system is improving, but it's still in place. And just the fact of Black people living, their existence can be interpreted as a crime. I mean, there's an organization which is called the Center for Policing Equity. And this is an organization which it's to kind of monitor how can the police, how can the legal system have a better relations with the community. But when they did research, they found that in some cities that most interactions between Blacks are a result of 911 calls. And it was not officer initiated stops. So what they found is that when they did the research of who was calling 911 on Blacks, it was white people. And they were calling Blacks for walking down the street, for distributing food to the homeless, on Black children. And, you know, everything was there specifically. One little girl was just selling water. So I don't want to go into the long laundry list of why this is being done to Blacks. But, you know, as a society, we know that when men show up, when armed men, you know, with guns show up, more force is used against Blacks than whites. And we live in a system today when white people call on deadly force just to ensure their comfort, just that they feel comfort. It's not actually that these Black people were really committing crimes. They just felt uncomfortable with them being where they were or what they were doing. And so there has been so many crimes against Black people that, you know, another thing that I wanted to say, that if you go and Google all of the massacres that have been done against Black people in America, you might be amazed to know that the American government dropped bombs on a flourishing Black community and they destroyed 35 square blocks. And in their initial report, they said that they killed 25 Black people. Actually, they killed 300. So if you look this up in the history, you will see that there's just a system in place because, you know, immigrants come here and they might understand, try to figure out what is wrong with these Black people. They've been here so long, but they don't know that they've been bombed, they've been murdered, their businesses have been stolen, their businesses have been destroyed. They were on land doing well, the land was taken away from them. They don't understand that this system of racism was meant to keep a person down. And they also had this idea of racism as being one group of people superior and another group of people inferior. But I don't really buy that, because if you really believe that these people are inferior, why do you put all these systems in place to keep them down? So it's not really the truth. So, you know, Islam addresses the idea of, you know, or the fact that nobody is superior to another. What it is your character and your behavior. And so now I'm finished with that. I could say that in the Islamic community, and I've been in several of them, and I've been in the Black community, and I've been in the immigrant community, and I've been in the immigrant community a lot. And I see a lot of inconsistencies. And I think that the inconsistencies that I see are basically bad habits. And I think that people are just not sensitive to the things that they do or say, and they're not thinking about the results of the things that they do and they say. Because I don't actually see the Muslims as these really bad people. I just see that, you know, when you develop a bad habit, you continue to do it. And so, you know, that's what I would say about that.
So I think it's very important, Sister Nafeesah, that you actually took the tangent of going into the mainstream broader community. And what I want to maybe ask Brother Kareem and Brother Sharif is do you see that value system of that systemic racism spreading its tentacles into the way that perhaps we structure our communities, the way that does that same racial profiling that is prevalent in white supremacy spread its tentacles into the Muslim mind? Yeah, I'll continue the question that way.
Who was that one for?
Go ahead.
Oh, for me.
Yeah.
I think that we have to look at the global and the global system that we have, which is racism, which is colonialism. I think the first thing we have to recognize, you know, who is the enemy of the Muslim? Who is the enemy of man? That's Shaitan. And Shaitan has placed all of these different mechanisms to perpetuate what he's trying to do. And colonialism is one aspect of that. Racism is another. With regards to colonialism, what are the things that happen in colonialism? How did they maintain that system and control? And if people go back and study it, they look at the fact that you take the lighter skinned person and downgrade the darker skinned person. That's been consistent throughout the globe, whether it be Indo-Pakistani or, you know, Asian, whether it be African American, wherever it is, it's always the lighter against the darker. That's one mechanism. And then there's the aspect of classism. Muslims come to this country and they're aspiring to, you know, have a good life. And they've been indoctrinated from when they were living in their home countries that there are certain professions that you go into to become a successful person, predominantly. And in some cases, other professions are looked down upon. I think those same types of attitudes that have been ingrained in immigrant Muslims for hundreds of years in colonialism. Do I see them in the masjid? Yes, most definitely I see them. Okay. what happens, I came out of, when I first became a Muslim, accepted Islam, not the Nation of Islam, accepted Islam, I was a part of a African-American masjid, Masjid Taqwa. And there was involvement, there was inclusion. I had a voice. And, you know, the most pious, the most learned among us was the one who was pushed out front, whatever. But then I see you come to other masjids, suburban masjids, where where you're maybe the only one or two African Americans there, and you don't have that same sense of inclusion. You don't have that same sense of brotherhood. You don't have that. And in fact, in some cases, you look down upon because you don't speak the language. You don't have a cultural history, and all of these types of things, okay? And I haven't personally experienced it as much as some others have. It hasn't affected me as much as some others have, because I was kind of insulated from that by being a part of the Nation of Islam, where I wasn't looking to be accepted by anybody outside of myself. I didn't care about who accepted me, and I still don't care who accepts me. I come to the masjid to do ibadah. That's it. If people like me, they don't like me, I really don't care. My only concern is my relationship with Allah. And in the process of doing that, but that speaks for me. That doesn't speak for the majority of people, I don't think. And I think that what happens is that the sisters, the children, especially the children, okay, they kind of push to the side. And where I may not need, and I'm kind of an introverted loner type person, but that may not be good, but that's who I am. But that's not the case for everybody. That's not the case for your children. You can't raise children and families in that way. So when you don't have that social life, that vibrant and nurturing social life, then you're missing something. You're losing out on something. And that's what I believe in my observations over the years. That's what's been missing primarily in the masjids and the immigrant masjids that we have become a part of. You know, it's one thing, as African Americans, we came from being second-class citizens in the broader society. And in many cases, you go to a masjid, a suburban masjid or whatever, and you become a second-class citizen all over again. Okay, it's the same thing. So why would anyone want to put themselves in that position? And I know, one brief, real quick story, and I'll pass the baton. But young man that I knew, he accepted Islam, and the introduction he got to Islam, learning, but the people who befriended him, the people who took him in, were basically people who were corrupt. They sold drugs. He didn't really find this out till later, but they sold drugs. And then what he said to me, he said, "But that's the way I learned Islam." And nobody else, they looked down on me. They looked down on me because I didn't know anything, and I felt like an outsider, so I stopped coming. And I could repeat that story many, many times with many, many people. Okay, but the thing I think is important to come out of it is that, like the sister said, people don't know us. Okay, they don't understand what our struggle is, both in this country and in the massages. They don't understand what are our needs. Our needs are not the needs that we have. Our families, our children are not the same as what someone else may have. And if you have a cookie cutter program where it deals with one particular thing, you're going to miss a lot of the subtle issues and attitudes and things that people need to become complete and whole. And that's missing. That's missing. So understanding, making the effort. I think the only thing to come out of this whole current situation that's important for me, the most important thing for the Muslim community is to take a look at themselves, at ourselves, and to see how we are doing the exact same thing, just on a different level. We're perpetuating that classism, that racism, okay, that discrimination on another level. Okay, people can be very polite. Muslims are very polite, but when it comes down to substance, I have. Now I'm not going to say I haven't seen it, because I have seen it, but in terms of across the whole spectrum, I think it's been lacking. So.
Bismillah. So much to reflect on based on what Sister Nafeesah and Brother Abdul Matin have said. I really believe in, and I really agree with this idea that the one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach does not work in trying to serve the needs of very diverse communities. And I have to name the fact that I've been a beneficiary in some way, the fact that I'm ethnically and racially ambiguous. I've seen the ways in which, Arab communities have embraced me, particularly after I learned Arabic through time overseas. I've seen the ways in which the South Asian community has embraced me and welcomed me in, and many people speaking Urdu to me, and these things, thinking that I was of a Desi background, etc. So I haven't actually experienced a lot of the ways in which exclusion and discrimination plays out in Muslim communities, and I need to name that. But what I have seen is the way in which Brother Abdul Mateen talked about a lack of substance. I agree. I have seen the ways in which when someone enters in Islam, I've seen this way too many times, and it's painful. How when someone enters into Islam, people the brothers will gather around him, or the sisters will embrace the sister who's embraced Islam, and there's all these congratulations and hugs, and this kind of brief episodic moment of hospitality and warmth and welcome. But where's the follow-up? Where's the community a week later, even weeks later, when someone is in a position to actually need actual support in terms of making this incredible transition from the life that they've lived and the patterns of their life, and they're trying to actually to learn their Islam. They're trying to deal with the incredible barriers that may be present in their home family. I received an incredible amount of resistance in parts of my family after I became Muslim. The transition wasn't easy for me, and it's much harder for many people. Where is the community when amidst that struggle? Where is the community? Where's the follow-up? Where's the sincerity in the friendship? Where's the sincerity in the sense of mahabba and welcome? Because it's there on that first day, but I've struggled, and I've really struggled to see the follow-up, and it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see how there isn't that follow-up. There aren't the programs, there aren't the spaces in which we truly get to know one another. There's kind of this superficial hello, goodbye. Our masajid, unfortunately, often have the kind of character, it's almost like a bank. One goes in, they have their spiritual transaction, so to speak, and then they leave. But people do not actually stay and build deep connections outside of their cultural and ethnic circles oftentimes. And it makes for what we call a unified community is actually pockets of people that don't interact on a deep level. They may pray in the same line, we may be reciting the same prayers, but we fail to deeply connect on a human level, to deeply appreciate and understand and learn one another's stories, one another's narratives, about one another's backgrounds. And I think we suffer as a community for that. So as a college chaplain, I work with young people, particularly the 18 to 24 age group, and I've seen the ways in which their relationship to the masajid, or even the prayer space on the campus where I work, is a very difficult one, and they're very concerned about stepping into spaces like the masjid or even the musalla, because they're so accustomed to the judgmental looks. They're so accustomed to the hand wringing of an elder, to the to the demeaning comments, to being ignored if they don't dress us exactly, you know, according to a certain way. And there just isn't this sense of inviting people inviting and inspiring people and truly welcoming them where they're at, and helping to gently encourage all of us to be better before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a sense of condemnation, the sense of judgment, which ultimately drives people away. And so one of the things that really irks me personally is when people say that Islam is the fastest growing religion. That annoys me for lots of reasons, because it makes us blind to the actual gaps and the shortcomings in our communities. Because in as much as people have embraced Islam in large numbers in this country, there's also, we don't talk about the fact, there's also large numbers of people leaving Islam because they have not found a sense of welcome, inclusion, and connection and community within a supposedly racially blind, egalitarian Muslim community. So that's the first fallacy. We have to lose this trope, this fallacy that racism doesn't exist within Muslim communities, because it absolutely does exist. And if we can't have an honest conversation about that, we're just fooling ourselves. So I will talk about this later, I imagine, but this is really a time for that first step towards healing, is just to have an honest conversation. Conversations like this, but also within our own homes and within ourselves, and just acknowledging the racism and the prejudice and the discrimination that may exist within us, because other people feel it. Even if we're not aware of the ways in which we may be acting out on it, other people are experiencing it, and it's keeping people away from the masjid. Or they're coming with their guard up. They don't feel like they're coming to a space they don't feel like they're coming home when they come to the masjid. The stress levels, the anxiety levels are amplified. And this is what I'm hearing from student after student after student that I work with, who's had this experience for years growing up in religious settings. These aren't people who are disengaged. These are people who have been engaged in their faith communities, but feel increasingly marginalized and unwelcome and uninspired, frankly, unfortunately, in our communities. And these are people who are not converts. I'm talking about people who are who are born and raised as Muslims. So imagine the experience for converts, people who are trying to acclimate, assimilate, and trying to deeply embed themselves within a Muslim community, but find resistance at every turn.
These are very powerful reflections, and I think one of the last things that you just said, Brother Sharif, is important to highlight. And they don't feel like they're coming home when they come to the masjid, and the masjid should feel like a home for everyone who says Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, or anyone who's looking to find that inclination in their heart. And unfortunately, that's not being found. And if you come to a place that you think should be a home and you find that it's not its home, what's the longitudinal effect of that? And that is pushing people away to find a different home. And so that's very difficult to see. And we see the longitudinal effects of certain communities. One thing I wanted to ask is, I think we have to take a very deep look at ourselves. And when we look at a suburban masjid like Hidaya, or many of the suburban masjids, I can count the African Americans that I see in the masjid on one hand on a given Jum'ah. And apart from when there are a lot of, the Quran school is in full effect, or weekend schools going on, for just an ordinary salah during the day, I can count the youth that come to pray at the masjid on a single hand. Is it fair to say that that's the anatomy of the community? There aren't that many people within those subsets, or is there more to it? How exactly are we falling short if we want to be genuinely introspective? What are some of the areas we're falling short in terms of serving the African American Muslim community? I know this discussion could go on for a long time if we wanted to talk about all of the different subsets, but feel free to comment on on the subset that resonates most with you, whether it's converts, whether it's African Americans, and so forth.
What I see is that a lot of the immigrants, they focus mainly on relationships of the broader white dominant community. They don't focus on having a relationship or even giving a salam to an African American or a darker person, no matter how many times you tell them. And it's not that there are not a lot of African Americans around, they are, but they have come to a lot of immigrant masjids. And this masjid, to me, is one of the masjids that has a lot of love, like once you get into the masjid. But the problem is that when they come repeatedly to Jummah, because maybe they work or their husbands work, so that's the main time when they can come. no one ever gives them a salam. So they stopped coming because, as African Americans, we came to Islam because we were impressed by it. We were in awe of it. And so, from what the Quran says, we knew that this was a good thing. But then, when we interacted with immigrants, a lot of immigrants, we saw a lot of behaviors which we wouldn't expect that the Muslims would have. And sometimes, I am light skinned. And so I've been in Islam for a long time. And when I was young, I was very pretty, and I could be, because of the hijab, I could, just like the brother, I could be considered maybe one of their people, different groups. And, Brother Abdul Mateen brought this thing up about color. I was born in America in the 50s, and it didn't matter if your father was black and your mother was white or opposite or whatever. It didn't matter if you had green eyes, blue eyes, and your skin was white. If you had black in your system, you were black. So we were raised like that. And then, like some of the behaviors that I see the immigrants coming to the masjid with, I saw these behaviors in my great grandmother or my grandmother because they were color struck. They believed in this light skin thing, opposed to, the darker people were like, oh no, light skin that's the way. You've got to be light skinned. And in, me, for 20 years, I didn't see the racism or these things. Alhamdulillah, Allah protected me for that for 20 years. But in the last 20 years, I saw it all over the place. But 4 different groups of people from different countries were trying to tell me that I am not black. They were like, why are you calling yourself black? Sister Nafeesah, you're not black. You're not black, So, a few of them, I don't want to say the countries, but one was like, you're mixed. And if I am mixed, what? So what? And one of them, this was the funniest thing. She kept saying to me, you're not black, you're white. And I was like, are you crazy? I am not white. She's like, I was the same complexion as her. She was like, well, you're my people white. So, every time, and it didn't matter the status because 2 of the people that were saying this to me were PhD brothers. So I can't answer these questions for these people, but I felt that colonization really, really, really did a number on them. And then the oppressor left. But we as African Americans, the oppressor never left. So we really got a chance to study him and see what was done to us and try to become better individuals. You don't find too much black people, saying, the light-skinned people are better or the dark-skinned people are better. And then in the 60s, there came this slogan, black is beautiful, be proud, and all of this, like Black Lives Matters now. When in the 60s, all the black people were like, black is beautiful. And before the 60s, there were no commercials on the television set that showed the black person. If a black person was on TV, it was a Newport cigarette commercial with a black lady on a swing with some thing in the background. So there were no commercials on TV about black people. But in the 60s, all of a sudden, it's like beautiful people use Afro sheen. I don't know if the white people took a look at how many blacks were in this country and how rich they could get by putting them on TV and selling products to them. But even on TV shows, there were a limited amount of black people, a very few number. So we were not included in society here. So we definitely know how it feels in the masjid. And me, like Brother Abdul Mateen, what I went through in the last 20 years, I do not come to the masjid looking for a friend. I come to the masjid because if I come to Juma, it's inspirational for me. If I study a class, it's inspirational for me. I'm very interested in Quran and tafsir, so I come to the masjid for those. And when immigrants basically invite me to their house, I don't go, because, they'll invite you to their house and they'll sit there and they'll speak Arabic the whole time, and they know that you don't speak the language. So, what are you going there for? You know what I mean? To drink some tea and look around. So, and also I don't want to hear what I shouldn't hear because I've already heard enough things. You know what I mean? Enough things have come back to me about myself that I never did, that I don't want to hear anything about anybody else. So I try to protect myself from that. And sometimes I moved to here 2 years ago to this area because I wanted to study in this masjid because they had so many classes available, so many things going on with Quran. So sometimes African Americans call me up and they're like, You didn't get tired of those people yet? And I'm like, I didn't come to the masjid for people. I came to the masjid to get closer to Allah, to understand Islam more. Even after 43 years, after you're studying, I still want to know more about Islam. And so, you know, I think that looking for friends in an immigrant masjid for African Americans, if this is their what they want, it's not what you're going to find, and opposed to in the church. It's very welcoming, it's very comfortable, it's a very nice place, but we can't go back there because of their beliefs. So we have to stay in this environment and do the best that we can do with it. And so that's all.
Yeah, I almost lost the question, but I remembered it again. Why don't they come? Is this what we have in the Capital District? Absolutely by no means. Okay. There's a couple of reasons. Nothing ever is reduced to one simple reason, but there's a reason of logistics. Where do Black people live? Okay. Where do Black Muslims live? Okay. And the majority of the Muslims live in the inner city, in the urban centers. So in some cases, it's purely logistical, because I can almost guarantee you'll probably find more African Americans going to ICCD than come here. Why? Because it's one bus line. Okay. Everybody doesn't have a car. We're not talking about, people who have money and whatnot, and they just don't have that. They don't have that option. So they go to what's closest to them. That's one reason. Additionally, it comes back to what the brother said and what the sister alluded to also, is that you want to come where you feel comfortable. And whenever an African American, I would say average new Muslim comes, somebody mentioned the term, they're always on guard. They just, like I said, they don't feel it's not home to them. Okay, it's not a comfortable environment. They come for the teaching, and most people want more than that. Most people want to feel like they're a part of a community, feel like they're accepted, feel like they're included. And when you come out after Juma and people are in their small groups, and they're talking, in some cases talking in other languages that you don't understand, what do? You stand around and wait for somebody to come? No, you just, okay, I'm good. I went to Juma, I leave. So those connections are not made. And I'm not gonna put it all on the immigrant, okay? But the thing you have to be is to be aware of why it happens. Why don't you see more African Americans in this masjid? And African Americans also come with a whole host of different issues and problems that need to be addressed. Give you an example. I was in two masjids, actually. Masjid down in Atlanta and Masjid Taqwa in Brooklyn. And after one of the things they had after Juma, they had they made announcements about jobs that were available and different services that were available for people in the community. You would never find that. I'm gonna say never, but that wouldn't happen here, because they were addressing the needs of those particular people in that community. And so that was the point. They felt comfortable in that environment because they know that their needs were being addressed. They know that there was a concern, that people understood them, and that felt like home to them. A lot of times, I think our immigrant brothers here, I think in all sincerity, I think they really, really want to reach out, but they don't know how. They don't know how, for whatever reason. And like your brother mentioned, we have to set up that environment so that people feel comfortable, so that it doesn't look like a symbolic effort when somebody talks to you, starts up a conversation and wants to get to know you better, and it's not superficial and symbolic. Because People can see right through that. Okay. But quickly, very quickly, how did I become included in this masjid? It wasn't through the social activity that was involved. It's because I worked as a part, I was part of the volunteering and working, fi sabilillah, different projects that came up, cleaning the masjid, whatever it was when we were on 15th Street. And so I became involved in the operation of the masjid. That's how I formed relationships. Okay, and so others who come, that's one avenue, but that's just me. If it wasn't for that, I would probably be in the same boat. I probably would be going somewhere else. But that's, like I said, that's but there are more, many more Muslims. Some of them are they're not practicing on a very high level because they don't go to masjids. They don't go to classes. Okay. And I put part of that, I put back on them. Okay, you cannot blame someone. Like the saying goes, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Okay, the ilm is there. So people have to be willing to take advantage of it, but the broader environment tends to keep people away. And we have to somehow get past that.
I'm not sure how much I can add to this particular question. But I will say that if you look behind us, there's a full library of books that represent, the scholastic tradition of Islam. And, it goes without saying that the liturgical and the scholastic, primary scholastic and liturgical language of Islam is Arabic, without doubt. That being said, because our prayers are recited in Arabic and because some of our greatest works of scholarship are in Arabic, we've allowed, I feel that we've allowed the centrality of the Arabic language in some way to transfer to a sense of Arab superiority in terms of dominant understandings of what makes for the most authentic expression of Islam. And so I've seen the effects of that, whereby there is this persistence of an kind of an implied superiority of the Arab peoples in many Muslim spaces, and it's there's kind of a doublespeak that happens as well. I should say that in as much as that happens, I've had the experience, whether it be in a cab in Jordan when I was living there for several years, or I've seen it in other settings, where someone will say to me, you converted to Islam, you're better than us because we were born Muslim, but you came into Islam by choice. We were born into Islam, we didn't have a choice. And so you chose Islam, so you're better than us. So on the one hand, I've heard that, and I've seen I've heard other people say, I've both been the recipient of that and also heard that in other settings. At the same time, where the rubber meets the road, when it really comes down to it, there isn't this sense of deference to the experience and the respect for the experience in the places that the convert and people who come into the community have been. There really isn't. That same person who says, "Oh, you're better than us," you've come and embraced Islam, whereas we were born into it. Ask that same person if he's willing to marry his daughter to an African American. That superiority only lasted so long, right? Like, forget that. He's not. There's no way most people would even countenance that from many immigrant communities. And I really hate to generalize here, but I've just seen this time and time again. So I think that we need to, in as much as Arabic is central to how Islam has been preserved, codified, and taught, that in no way implies a superiority of some people over another. Yet somehow we've imbibed that in our communities, and so there are superiority inferiority dynamics that are happening all the time in our communities, and at great effect. So I think one of the things to do is to begin to name the problem honestly and acknowledge it, and then to begin to think about how we decentralize the superiority. Even if we say that's not happening, it is happening. To decentralize the sense of superiority of certain understandings and the idea that some communities or some cultures have are more authentically Muslim because they have greater linguistic access to certain texts and teachings. So I think that's really a critical piece to this.
I wanted to go back to something that Brother Abdul Mateen pointed out. Everybody actually pointed out something very interesting. And Sister Nafeesah, when you pointed out that some people came up to you and would comment on your complexion and saying that you're white, I want the audience to understand that they're basically saying, hey, you don't have to go with the label that you're saying. You can be white. You can tap into this and upgrade. Is really what some people are implying, which is just absolutely outrageous. And then Brother Abdul Mateen, when you were pointing out the very important point that both in the masjid in Atlanta as well as the Masjid Taqwa in Brooklyn, that the masajid were appealing to the needs of the people. This reminded me of a story that I heard about with Dr. Rudolph Bilal Ware, who's a historian at University of California, Santa Barbara, on a talk he was giving about hip hop, spirituality, and social change. And he was talking about, a lot of people want to talk about how maybe they're turned off from African-American Muslims because they listen to hip hop music or whatever it is. By the way, most people are listening to the culture of hip hop. He's saying, look, there were nights, I didn't live in the same house for a single year. I didn't go to the same school district for more than one calendar year. We were jumping from house to house to house. And there were many nights where I didn't have food. I guarantee you, if a Muslim from a middle-class suburban masjid came to my house and brought me a hot meal on any one of those nights, that I would have listened to anything you gave me. I would have memorized that Quran, and I would not have memorized the hip-hop lyrics that I know. But you didn't come, and you're still not coming. And this was the point that he made, and it was a very, very powerful point, and not one that I've really recovered from yet, because I've mostly been in middle-class suburban masajid. And that goes to underline the next question, and that is, practically speaking, I know we said some of the things already, but practically speaking, from what hasn't been said, what can be done to make these places more inclusive? I know we talked about some of the outreach that we've done. We have the Soup Kitchen project and so forth, but what can the masjid really do? I know appealing to the needs of the community, but some reflections from the panelists of what the masajid can do to really bring in the true colors and vibrancy that our community has. Maybe Brother Abdul Mateen, you want to kick this one off?
Yeah. I think all of us touched on one aspect of it. And I think right now, for us to expect any grand plan or direction to come out of these conversations, out of this, that would be kind of misguided to think that could actually happen. But as you said, what practically can be done, I think at this particular point, the focus has to be on the youth. And when I say youth, I mean, well, Ahmad, your age and down, okay?
30 and down. The rest of you guys.
Your age and down.
That's rough.
When I say youth, I'm talking about my children's age and down, because that's where the change is going to come. The change is not going to come from us old guys. That's not really where it's going to come from. And until the youth who've also been a part of this society, who have interacted with, they've gone, in most cases, they've gone to public school, they've made friends, they understand some of the issues that are involved, and in an intimate way, and make intimate friends with Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think that generation is the key to all of this, okay? And the problem that I see is that we haven't, generally speaking, the masajids have not empowered the youth enough, okay? They have to empower the youth, the next generation, okay, to come and be a part of this discussion and empower them to kind of be much more involved in some of the things that are going on. Because right here in this masjid alone, if you bring all of the older, my generation, bring them all together, and let's brainstorm how we're going to do this. Most cases, they don't have a clue. Okay, they'll mention have a dinner, they'll mention this or they'll mention that, but they don't have a clue. But if you talk to 40 down, and the ones who've grown up in this country, the ones who've been interacted with other ethnic groups within this country, who've gone to school with other ethnic groups, who have, in some cases, played sports with other ethnic groups, okay? Ask them, how do we do that? And I think that you'll get a much different answer, a much more creative, much more substantive answer about how we do it. So I think the discussion needs to take place. And I think this discussion does, in fact, need to continue and take place. But I think this discussion is to recognize, the first thing is have the discussion, and not necessarily in big grandiose groups. I think we need to have smaller groups, targeted groups, 10 people, sit down, different people, different groups of people in the community. You notice someone who comes to Juma on a regular basis. Listen, brother, we would like you, let's sit down and maybe have dinner together and let's have some discussion, have some talk. I think that way, in those smaller types of groups, I think you're going to get more dialogue, more discussion, and vary it amongst people. Okay. But the discussion has to take place, and I think that it has to be targeted, and we really, really have to work on empowering the generation that's coming, that's going to succeed us, because our time is at hand. We have one foot in the grave, okay, and whether we're willing to relinquish power or not, Allah will relinquish the power from us, will take the power from us. And so if we want to make a smooth transition, a guided transition, then we will start to make more of an effort to focus on that generation.
Okay. Before the next panelist comments on this question, I just want to remind our viewers to please put your questions into the chat box on both the YouTube or the Facebook link that is streaming this. Going back to the question itself, what are some practical steps to bring out the vibrancy in our community? Sister Nafeesah, would you like to comment on this question, or Brother Sharif?
Well, I think that one thing that the community should just address the racism, because it will improve the environment if they just address it. And I can't say how they could address it, but they can think of ways, because if you create an environment that's representative of diversity and it's welcoming, and you celebrate the difference, the ethnic differences, then everybody will feel included. But if you have a masjid where African Americans are not going there, then you have to think how to get them there in the future. So as he said, you may want to hire African American youth on staff that's good in Quran, maybe Arabic, maybe Islam. Quran practices well, because we looking towards the future, actually. I would also think that people should just recognize their faults and try to correct themselves, to look inside themselves and look inside themselves and try to step outside of themselves for the betterment of the community. I mean, you're comfortable with who you are, but is that really the best person to be for the community? If you're talking about being inclusive, this, when you asked this question, it came in my mind, you need a task force to solve this problem. But, in my mind, that was a joke. So I think that you have to look at that, because in the Muslim community, half of the Muslims in America are immigrants. Okay, so from the other half, only about 20% of them are not African American. So that means that there's another third, a huge group of individuals within Islam that are African American. So it's don't even think that they're not there. They're there. So if you want them in your masjid, you have to find ways to address their needs and welcome them. And you may need a committee to do that. So, and you don't need discussion is one thing, but you can discuss and do a feasibility study and all kind of studies. But somebody needs to do some work, to get the job done. Talk. Somebody needs to do work to get these things done. If you want people to be inclusive in your community, or it's not, it won't change. Oh, one thing I want to tell you, I went to Syracuse in the 90s to help them open up an Islamic school. And after 2 months, I didn't want to be in that place. I called the imam and I was crying and I was like, it was Ahmed Nidar Kobesi. I was like, I want to go back. I want to go back to Albany. I don't like this place. I want to leave here. So he was like, what's your problem? I was like, my friend that told me to come here, she's not really my friend. I never even see her. So he was like, well, you don't have enough to do. So he hired me to work in the masjid in Syracuse, right? The Islamic Center of Central New York. And, there were African Americans going to that masjid, right? But until he hired me, they really didn't know who he was. So once he hired me, I used to go back and tell the sisters, oh, the imam said this, the imam did that. So they were like, oh, this guy's really a person. Oh, he's funny. He tells jokes. He has a good relationship with the youth. So from him hiring me, from me telling them about how much of a positive experience this was, it kind of bridged the gap where the people saw him, the African Americans saw him in a much better light because they understood him. He was a good imam, but he was very official. When they came to talk to him, he spoke officially. He didn't look at them. You know this. But when I worked for him, I was always around him, and I saw him in so many different lights. And the thing about it, he was so funny with the kids that sometimes, you can't laugh because you can't let the kids know that this is so funny. But when I left, he didn't want me to leave, but I wanted to leave, because Syracuse was like 110 inches of snow. And, I just wanted to leave that place. So
12 probably, but who's counting?
So I just wanted to say that sometimes just putting one African American on staff will help to bridge a gap, because they come somewhere, they don't see anybody who looks like them. They're like, we're not included in this masjid. Why are we going to come here?
SubhanAllah. Very, very beautiful reflections. And I think I have some important notes on that. And when you said you need a task force, you're not wrong. You're not wrong with that. That's not even close to being a joke. That is part of the answer. We need to have, I would use the term think tank, but it's arriving at the same thing. It's really 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Brother Sharif, anything you'd like to add to this question?
Yeah, I would add a few things. I certainly believe in greater representation, both on our masajid boards and, in terms of the composition of our teachers, greater diversity there. But, we also, there's a trap too with that we don't fall into the trap of tokenization. And so as we invite people into roles that they've not typically held, like in this community or others, to really, people who are doing the hiring or the invitation around those roles need to really check themselves and see, am I really bringing these people in because I want to, quote unquote, address the diversity issue? Or do I really value the experience, the knowledge, and the places that this person has been or people have been, because I know that our community will be richer and will be more vibrant for what they bring. And it's in that spirit that I think that we should diversify the masajid board, diversify our teachers, diversify the people in our community who are engaged with the youth, etc. It's from that experience, not to check off boxes, but because we truly believe that we are deficient as a community unless we have a wider representation of experiences and perspectives and life stories. So that would be the first thing. And I think in terms of any practical steps, there's no more practical step that we can take than to do an honest, introspective look at ourselves, as was said by some of the panelists earlier, because the collective work that we need to do as a community will be much easier to discern if we're on the path of doing that individual work within ourselves. That means having honest conversations within our own homes and in our own families about the way racism and discrimination may be playing out in our own lives. To not assume that we're exempt from holding discriminatory attitudes and behaviors, and and ideas. Another thing is to read and educate ourselves about American history, to get informed about the experiences of other communities, be that the native and indigenous peoples in this country who were exterminated during westward expansion, and to pave the way for civilization in this society as we know it. Millions of people died during that expansion, tens of millions of natives, and we know little to nothing. They're a completely invisible community in this country. The Native American experience is hardly understood. So to begin to read and educate ourselves about the Native experience, to begin to read and educate ourselves about African American experiences. So this is really a time of, I think, in as much as the communal work needs to happen, it will only be as rich and as effective as the individual, personal, spiritual, educational deep dive that one does into their own prejudices, beliefs, attitudes, understanding, and knowledge. So there's lots of ways to develop closeness to Allah, to develop a stronger community. And it's not only through reading texts that are explicitly religious, but to actually deepen one's sense of understanding of place and time and culture. So I think a lot needs to be done. So multiple streams need to be happening at once. It's no single project. It's no single solution, as Brother Abdul Matin mentioned. It's actually a multifaceted approach that needs to happen. And some of those small groups could be small reading groups that are being convened, where we're reading books like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is about the massacre of Native Americans that paved the way for that this obliterated Native society and the impacts of that. Reading books like, I'm reading a book right now called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which is a very, very powerful book. And it's about why white people have trouble talking about racism. And it's just, The New Jim Crow is another book that I would highly recommend. So there are important books in the that deal with these issues on a very critical and important level, that are part of the empowerment, but also part of building a more inclusive and more loving community ultimately. Because all of these things, I think, there's spiritual crises at the heart of all of this. At the heart of all of this is this inability to truly embody that prophetic love, compassion, and depth of welcome and inclusion that was his way, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And our inability to do that stems again from barriers that are superficial, artificial constructs that we've allowed to block our ability to see the beauty in Allah's creation, to see the beauty in one another. And there's lots of ways that we can begin to address that, but we do that as we have to have some honest conversations, and this is just one piece of it today, inshallah.
Can I mention one book? He mentioned some books, and I want to add 2 books to that list for people if they want to read and get a better understanding. One is called, and both of these books are on Amazon if anybody's interested. One is called Willie Lynch, The Making of a Slave. Okay, powerful book. I'm not going to get into any details about it, but it's a powerful book in order to understand what being a slave was all about. The other one is called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Okay, and that's also on Amazon or whatever, and that's talking about the after effect, the traumatic effect of slavery and the after effect on the African American people to this day, and some of the attitudes and feelings that are inherent in the part of the community. Those are 2 books that I would recommend if you want to read a little bit more and understand the experience a little bit better. That may help you do that.
Okay, me.
Of course, feel free to add.
I wanted to say that the brother was saying about what I wanted to say, that the history books have been scrubbed. The history books have been, what's put in the history books is what the oppressor wanted in there. So that's why you can't find a lot of things about African American. And I was teaching in SUNY in a program, and the students wanted to become scientists. So I wanted them to do a report on Black scientists. And so I had to go to the reference library and find that there was an encyclopedia of, it was called the Negro because it was up to maybe 1970, of all the contributions that Black people had made to American society. And I'm not sure if it was 12 volumes or 6 volumes, but the books were like, the encyclopedia was like this big and this big. 20 by 12 with very tiny, tiny print. So I copied so many of the scientists and I distributed them to the students so that they could know what different Black scientists did. And another thing, the brother had, a book I think you should get. It's called the Osage. The Osage were a group of Indians that became millionaires, and their community was complacent in trying to exterminate them. And the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, that organization was formed to try to understand who was killing all these Indians because their whole community was. So another thing about the Indians, 130 million Indians were killed. Indians were sold into slavery. People were offered prices for cutting off Indians' heads. And they killed so many Indians that I read in one article that there was such a thing as global cooling. So I never heard of global cooling. So a lot of things, you have to do research to really, really, really find out the extent of what was done and what was left out of the history books. Also, another book that I would recommend is called Ebony and Ivy. It's by Craig Stephen Wilder. It talks about the 9 prestigious universities and their hand in slavery and the things that they have done to the Blacks in the Black community. So I think that that's a good book. Then you can have an idea of how it wasn't just the South that was involved in this. This was the American. They may have had the plantations, but there was a lot of money being sent down there, and a lot of things were being done to African Americans in the North. And so this book examines the Ivy League colleges, their hand in a lot of things that went on in slavery and the things that they did to African Americans, the terrible things.
Barakallahu feekum. These are very thought-provoking comments, and I think we have a lot of work to do. And what Sister Nafeesah said earlier about the discussion is good, but we need people to do work. That's what's important, and that corroborate and Brother Sharif provides corroborating evidence with some of his points, like having an honest discussion, and we have a deep look at ourselves and seeing what is the portion of racism that's in our own hearts. That's a discussion that we still need to have in this series, but I wanted to comment on something that I think Brother Kareem, Abdul Matin, and myself both saw Shane Atkinson talk at the conference last year in Atlanta, the annual Black American Muslim Conference. And this was a man, he was a white convert to Islam, who told us that when he was a kid, his grandfather taught him how to make a noose, right? And he eventually converted to Islam, but he was commenting on how he and 3 or 4 other brothers were having a spiritual retreat, and the theme of the spiritual retreat was healing from white supremacy, basically purifying themselves from racism. And so I think we do need to have, deep discussions where we are educating ourselves on the topic, looking at how deep this really cuts into society, and really calling ourselves to terms, because we will have the responsibility of presenting our hearts back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a pure state, and we want to have it still be on the fitrah with the wisdom of our years. A beautiful comment I heard in another session that, again, by Dr. Ware was, and this goes with Brother Sharif's point about not doing this out of tokenization, but rather because this includes vibrance to our community and will be a true strength. And the point that Dr. Ware was making was, we have to realize that the African American community is the only community that's actually survived white supremacy. They're the only, it's a miracle. They're the only community that actually survived white supremacy and rebelled against it and rose against it. Much of the immigrant community, whether it's the Middle East or North Africa or Southeast Asia, still has the effects of white supremacy prevalent in their minds, in the sense that the way they structure the communities, the way they view color, the way they view color within their own people, and how preference to lighter skinned girls for marriage over the darker skinned girls and so forth. And the way we anglicize our names and the way we seek to dress and whatnot. You can talk about baggy pants all you want, but that's actually rebellion against the system. You can talk about the way people are trying to change the way their names are pronounced in the African American community, but that's a rebellion against the system. You can talk about rap music all you want, but hip hop and rap music in its original form, if it has a religion, is very, very much trying to call many of the rappers actually deep down, they are Muslim. And a lot of what they're saying resonates with Islam. And so I think there's a ton of strength that we gain from that. And we have to view it in that way. There's a lot of strength we can gain from inviting the vibrancy that exists in the community, whether it's the African American community, whether it's the women in the community. There's no way that our community can rise without giving the same space to half of its constituents, namely being women, and that's its own other discussion. I think I'm hearing a lot of book discussions that should come out of this. Obviously, reading alone is great, but reading with others is even better. And there's a lot of healing that can and should be done with that. We have just a few minutes left. We have 4 minutes left before, I believe, Asr Adhan is called. And so I just wanted to ask for any closing comments from the panelists before we call it a day. And inshallah, look forward to our next discussion.
I'll just say that not too much to add, except the fact that this discussion about race and violence and discrimination is also happening in the context of a global pandemic right now, which has forced us to into modes of isolation and hopefully modes of reflection that we haven't previously been compelled to engage in the same ways we are now. And so, in as much as we're talking about issues of social and communal implications, as we've said, and it's come up from each of us in our own ways, this is also a time for, this time is begging us to do some of that individual, introspective, honest work. You know, I'm reminded that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawamina bil qist. Shuhada'a lillahi ala anfusikum aw al-walidain. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you know, you who believe, be vigilant in establishing justice, even against your own selves, and or your parents. So this is a time to really understand the value of this reflective and introspective work as a spiritual practice, and to just look at how we're living. I mean, I'm using this time, I'm trying to use this time to look at how I live, to look at what my barriers are to love, compassion, and justice for the people around me and the communities that I'm in. This is a time to think about what we watch, what we listen to, what we read, what our intake is, because what we take in has a direct relationship to what comes to what our output is. To look at our diets, to look at our physical regimen. You know, what are we doing to actually strengthen ourselves intellectually, spiritually, physically, emotionally, to be able to understand what Allah is getting at in this time, because this is a time that has not only not only in our national questions being evoked in this time. This is a global, and if not a wider celestial kind of time to instigate very, very deep questions and change, ultimately, of a kind that we're only beginning to understand, perhaps. So, I would just invite myself and all of us to do the honest work, to leave the pretenses to getting it, and to strengthen knowledge, and just to do the most courageous thing right now, which is to look at how we live, and to the extent that love, compassion, justice, all these things we talk about, to the extent it's really happening in our lives, both towards one another and also within our very selves. Because a lot of the hatred and discrimination that we manifest towards other people might just be a manifestation of our own inward hatreds and our own inward sense of self-contempt, and not appreciating the gift that Allah has placed and reposited within us as people who are vice regents and custodians and stewards of this land and the times that we're in. So there's a lot happening right now, only some of which we're aware of. But with that which we're aware of, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do, inshallah ta'ala.
If I could just take us very quickly to something I said earlier, in terms of the fact that it's mentioned in numerous times in the Quran that Shaitan is the enemy of the Muslim and the man. Shaitan is the enemy. And that's not just in a spiritual sense, that's in an economic sense, that's in all spheres of our life. All of these things that we're talking about, the racism, the injustice, it's all a manifest. Shaitan is using our nafs in different forms and different people, and to build off of the fact of we need to do tazkiyah on ourselves, but Shaitan is using us. And in many cases, we're allowing him to use us. And I just encourage myself and everyone to fight back and understand that we're not enemies of each other. We're enemies of Shaitan. And we should all be looking at how he's manipulated us individually and in groups against each other. And we need to rise above that, inshallah.
Sister Nafeesah, any closing comment? Otherwise, we have we're going to close for Salah, I believe.
No.
I just wanted to thank everybody for their participation in this panel. Thank you so much for taking from your time, Sister Nafeesah, Brother Kareem, and Brother Sharif. We have another discussion coming up next week from 7 to 8:30 p.m. next Friday with Imam Dawood Walid from Care, Michigan. And that will be, the topic of that discussion will be being leaders for justice. And so that's once we've cleaned up our own hearts and our own doorsteps and we've fortified the vibrance in our communities, how do we use our Islam? How do we use the beauty that Allah has done on our hearts to bring about positive change in the broader community, not just limited to Muslims? So please look forward to that discussion, to the viewers who are tuning in. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts our efforts and He allows us to see that this is just the beginning and there's a lot of important work that needs to be done afterwards, and that Allah gives us the fortitude, the strength to go forward and do what needs to be done, as well as the patience in the time that it takes to bring about the change that's needed in the society. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the vision and the courage and the strength. خُذِ الْكِتَابَ بِقُوَّةٍ وَآتَيْنَاهُ الْحُكْمَ الصَّبِيَّ. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the strength that Prophet Yahya had and that all the prophets had. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khair, everybody, for tuning in. Please have a blessed evening.